Yes, that title is fairly long and fairly convoluted, but I think the picture of me actually sums it up a little bit better, where I'm using my daughter's medical equipment to take the pulse of a canola plant, because this is really what we are very interested in. We're trying to decipher information about what the plant is telling us, what status it is at, what can we learn about its stress, because most people will agree that the time when we see the biggest problems with pests, whether that being diseases or insects or other pests for that matter, is typically when the crop is stressed. So really, we can go upstream and try to look at what can we, and this is really the approach that we are trying to take in the research that we do, is what can we do to minimize the risk of the plant, of the crop ever becoming stressed. So that means that we have to follow it. That means that we have to have smart tools at our disposal, and we can't ask them because we can't speak canola yet. Maybe we can one day, but what we can do is we can try to use the signals that it is providing about its health status, such as the way it reflects light and other sources of the volatiles that it is emitting. We can use those to make smart decisions and convert that into what are the inputs that are needed for this plant to come out of that stress status, so that it's less likely to become infested, and that we therefore are going to see a yield loss at the end. So, and that's really the denominator of these three components here. So the way we can use fertilizers, and I'll come to that towards the end, how we can use drones to decipher the reflectance signaling. Hamlin was talking about this morning, so he gave a great background for some of the work that we're going to be doing. And we are also looking at ways, tools that we can use to make smarter decisions when we have to put the hammer down. When we have to go out and spray, how can we do that in a smart way? And that's actually where I'm going to start my talk, is how can we do that in a particular way? And we have developed, with COGO funding, we have developed a new tool that is available. I'm standing in the COGO booth out there. We're giving it away for free. I can give you a rundown of how it works, and I'll give you some of the inputs and why I think this particular tool may be of interest to you. And how we can use it to make smarter decisions on how we can easily adjust our spraying settings, how we can maybe also time our applications a little bit better so we get a better coverage and therefore also get a better performance and therefore ultimately save money and do better. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm trying to address in this presentation. How can we determine whether we have a problem or not? And I'm going to do that towards the end, because we have some reasons to believe that we can use fertilizers to manipulate, if we apply them not uniformly, but use certain patterns and knowledge about how insects or other, well, particularly insects, how they respond to crop, the nutritional composition of a crop. We can use that to sort of divert them or manipulate them in a particular part of our paddock, and therefore we know that if they're going to occur this year, this is where they're going to be. But I'm going to start here with the spray applications. So what I'm going to show is we have developed this phone app, and it's a combined phone app and a website. As I said, that's completely free. You just have to register, and then you can use it on your smartphone. It works for Android, it works for iPhone, both operating systems. It's based on a large body of data that we collected using these water-sensitive spray cards, where we correlated the actual coverage we got on these spray cards with weather conditions and different settings, different nozzles, spray volumes with and without adjuvants, how fast we were driving, all this kind of stuff. So when you open up the website, or you open up your tablet or whatnot, you get into this main page here, where if you want to predict your spray coverage, so suppose you want to go out tomorrow, you put in what is your volume going to be? Are you going to use an adjuvant? How fast are you going to be driving? Which nozzle are you going to be using? Some weather parameters, if you have some idea, you can then use, and then you just simply press this, and you'll be able to calculate what sort of coverage you're going to be getting. And to give you a quick idea of how this might be helpful, so suppose you put in these, because I thought these might be some very sort of widely used settings, that suppose you were going to put out 60 liters per hectare. Well, so then under these conditions, you would actually only get 5.2% coverage. If I then said, well, I'm going to add some adjuvant, some SP700 or something to my formulation, I would actually double my coverage just by adding that adjuvant. I can also say, well, I'm going to go with a little bit coarser nozzle. Okay, so just by doing that, now I'm almost at 15%. Okay, and then if I even wanted to go and use a little bit more water, not the 60 but the 80, I would come up here. So with some very, very simple settings, I could the night before, if I was going to go out and spray tomorrow, I could just change my nozzles. I could just maybe put a little bit more water in, and then I could actually see the benefits of that. Reversely, I could also be in a scenario where it doesn't matter what I do, maybe because of the weather conditions, I would still be down here in this very, very low range, and it would basically tell me, don't go out and spray tomorrow. It's absolutely pointless. You're just going to be wasting fuel and time. So this is a way to optimize, find out whether you actually, because if you think you are going to need to spray, well, you also want to make sure that if you go out and spray, that you're actually getting something out of it. And this is a little tool that can help you do that. Another way, for instance, we're hearing about farmers that are now rushing 30 kilometers per hour through the field, okay? Now this is like Paris-Dakar, that's very, very fast. And simply by looking at some different, if we keep everything else constant, but we just go a little bit slower, we can actually see that, of course, we get a much better coverage. Now the question, of course, you may have is, what does all this mean? What is the difference between 10% coverage and 16% coverage? That's the part we're going to be working on with the specific chemicals and try to find out what should be the coverage that we should be trying to get with the different chemicals. But this is at least a start, and you can download this for free. And just to give you an idea why this is important and take it a couple of steps further, we ran this last year up in Mingenew where we just set up a little patch here. We created a little patch of crop, and then Brooke was spraying it through, and we put out the spray carts. And this is the spray cart we would get. We use different nozzles just to illustrate sort of the difference. This is what you can get at the top. And this was just at the bottom of the canopy on the same plants, okay? Now this, guys, ladies and gentlemen, this is what you want to be effective, okay? This is what you expect to kill whatever pest you have. This coverage, okay? And this is precisely the problem, is that this tool here that we're using calculates the spray coverage at the top of the canopy, but this is what we are facing when the card is facing upwards. Imagine on the underside of that leaf where the pests typically hang out, okay? We are expecting a lot from our chemicals, okay? And this is probably why we're running into resistance issues. And so this is why we are very interested in also, and this is where the phone app can also be used. You can actually put out spray cards, and I can show you. I have some plants and some spray cards and squirt bottle. We can play with it if you want to come over and visit me in the Cocoa Box. I can show you how this all works, how you can actually put spray cards out in your field or in your paddock, and you can calculate what sort of spray coverage you're getting as a quality control. If you're paying somebody to do it, make sure that you get the service that you want, okay? Don't pay him or her for something that they're not doing. Or if you're doing it yourself, use this to keep record of how well you're doing. And why is coverage so important? Well, I'll give you some ideas about this. So we have some in the lab, we have some technology where we can track individual insects around on a leaf. So here we've taken a canola leaf, we've put some sunscreen, which we found out works really well as a barrier. So the diamondback moth larva cannot escape, it will run around in here. We can follow it around, track it around, see how fast it moves, how often it moves to the left, how often it moves to the right. And we can divide the leaf into two zones. We can use the midrib here, and then say we can put water here, and we can put chemical A over here, or we can put chemical A here and chemical B here, and we can leave them in there for so long, we can then see how they perform. And this is what we get. So this is a little bit hard to see, but you can can you see that? There's a red little trail here. So this is when you have water. You will see that the insect sort of moves around sort of fairly randomly. This is what happens when you have chemical on this side and you have water on this side. They shy away from it. So these critters are not physiologically resistant to the chemical, but they can feel that there's something nasty about this surface, so they shy away from it. So if we are not getting good enough coverage, we're essentially offering them a choice between treated and untreated surfaces. And if we only have 5% coverage or 3% coverage or even 10%, well, there's still 90% of leaf that they can still feed on without ever getting in touch with the chemical. And this is where it gets problematic. So that's why it's so important that we get this good coverage and we make sure that our spray rig is set up to give the highest performance, that we put out as much water as we possibly can. Now, I also understand you can't go 12 kilometers an hour and use a nozzle for 120 liters. I understand that. And that's where we come to the next part of the talk, because we can actually get away from spraying the entire fields. We can be smart about where we apply our chemicals and maybe only use them on parts of our paddocks. But we got to acknowledge that these critters are smart. They've been around for millions of years, and we have been doing farming for thousands of years, and we've been using chemicals for decades, and they're still laughing at us. And we come up with new chemicals, and they immediately get resistant to them. Why? Because they have a lot of behavioral and genetic mechanisms, and that's why it's so hard for us to rely on this only. We have to be a little bit smarter. And that's why this preventative medicine, where we try to avoid the pest establishing in the first place, becomes really important. Because they feed non-randomly. They don't just feed on any plant. They don't just feed on any part of the plant. They know where to pick. They know where to go to lay their eggs, to optimize. They are also doing risk assessment, just like you are. They're doing the same thing. A female that lays her eggs, she's trying to figure out, where should I lay them? And she has learned, acquired through selection and evolution, she has learned where to put her eggs. So she avoids this treated surface and goes somewhere else if we give her a choice. Now we can use that to our advantage. And this is where we then come into the fertilizer aspect of this talk, and where we can be very, very smart. We are very interested. We work with Craig Scanlon and some other people, some brilliant plant physiologists, and we're also very interested in working more with the soil fertility people. We're very interested in understanding much better what we're seeing when we do these very simple choice tests, where we set up pots of canola or whatever crop we're working with, and we fertilize them differently. If we vary the amount of potassium in our pots, and we do a 3-choice test, so we have level A, B, and C of potassium in these pots, and these plants are otherwise the same. If we then give them a choice like that, we can see that the insects clearly prefer the ones that either have a high or either a low or a very, but particularly a low level of potassium. The ones that have sort of a mid-range, they don't prefer them. We see the same when we went out to Craig's plots, and he had actually conducted some real commercial size, not commercial, but big field plots. We dug up those plants, took them home, and did a 2-choice experiment. Put them in a cage and let the aphids themselves choose which plant they wanted to establish on. They preferred the low level. Okay? So clearly they can see a difference. There's something about these plants. There's something about the signals that the plant is providing that tells the aphid that this is a better plant than the other. And for them, a plant with low potassium is clearly more preferable. And there's a lot of literature that actually supports this. I'll just show another example where we set up some, we have very young Leberforts at UWA, where my daughter was helping me set up some small plots of canola, emerging canola. And we actually had 2 different levels of potassium here. And we could also see that the red-legged earth mites, when we sampled them in these adjacent plots, there was a clear level, after a couple of weeks, we saw a clear difference that there were far more on the ones that had low potassium compared to the high potassium. So potassium, you've just had some beautiful talks about how you need to do a very careful analysis of your soils. We also learned earlier about how important it is to really understand our nutrient management. Well, here's another reason why we need to look into this, because nutrient management can be an integral part of our pest management strategies as well. And this is just to highlight, the title says itself, effect of potassium nutrition on pest and disease resistance in plants. They basically studied over 2,000 studies, published studies, and they found a marked negative correlation. So the more potassium was offered to the plants, the less problems they had with diseases, with insects, and other pests. So potassium is clearly another tool we can add to the toolbox when we want to look at how we're going to manage our pests, so that we reduce our reliance on pesticides, and maybe therefore we also minimize the risk of them becoming infested in the first place. And we can go even further, because we are now working together with Craig. we got some GIGC funding for this year, we're going to be looking at an approach where we under-fertilize the perimeter of paddocks to make it more attractive. So if this is going to be, if this year for some reason becomes a big aphid or diamondback moth year or something, we predict that they will infest those perimeter bands around the paddock the first and the hardest. So it will be much easier to scout because we are manipulating the system. We're trying to let them, okay, if you are going to show up, this is where you're going to be. So if you're going to show up, we will know where you are so we can detect you early, and then we can come in with the big hammer. Then we can come in with 120 liters a hectare, and we can spray go much lower, and we can go with a big nozzle because we only have to spray the perimeter. So we can blast them out of there. So we're manipulating them to come, if they're going to show up, this is where we want them. And then we can scout for them, and if we see them, either by using drone technology or through regular scouting, bang, that's where we can get them. So this is where it all sort of hangs together. So the last part of this talk is about how we want to use machine eyes, how we want to use drones, how we want to automate the sampling of the stress signals that the plant is giving us, and therefore also where we need to take action. So we've done a lot of work with potassium. We've done some field work where we've grown these plants under different potassium levels. We can see clear indications of potassium, and we can also separate that reflectance signal that they give in response to potassium, and it's also different from the response that they give to insects. So we can separate the two, which means that we know that they're different, they cause different levels of stress in the plants. We are now moving into the next area where we're actually taking different cameras. So here we have Hamlin mentioned that briefly this morning. We have what's called a hyperspectral camera, which collects a lot of spectral data in very narrow wavelength bands. And then then Lloyd is also holding a multispectral camera, which we can actually mount on a drone and then fly it outside as we're doing here. And that will create an image like that of these plants. And what we just recently found out is that when we run this test and we have some of these plants infested with cabbage aphids and diamondback moths, and some of them being controls, we can actually see that there's a very, very clear correlation between the reflectance signal we get when we fly outside with what we get inside. And that's very, very important, because Hamlin was also talking about how this calibration, this spectral repeatability, there's a lot of issues with that. But the fact that we see a fairly nice, tight, straight line between this means that we can work both in the lab and out in the field and get pretty good, and we can correlate the results directly. So that's very, very interesting. And when we look at how the different response, so if we look at diamondback moths and cabbage aphids and oat aphids, they give different signals. So there is really a language. We have to listen. If we listen carefully enough to what the plant is telling us in terms of how it reflects light, it actually responds differently to whether it's being infested by A, B, C, or D. So we then need to develop these algorithms so that we can say to the farmer, this is the problem he has. You have this pest and you have not this pest. And it's not a nutrient deficiency, it's a pest problem, or it's a drought stress response. So we can decipher and make, to convert this into specific management solutions. So with this pest management strategy, where we combine new tools and think of preventive medicine, trying to make the plant as healthy as possible in the first place so that it doesn't get infested, with this strategy, we believe that we can use fertilizers, use them smartly, maybe not applying them once, but maybe applying them multiple times during the growing season, not all at once, especially with potassium, which is a very mobile nutrient. Maybe we have to come in with a second dose later on, but use the fertilizers to reduce the susceptibility of the crop. We think we can use this to optimize where to scout, because we make that perimeter more attractive than the rest of the paddock. So we also want to know, so we know where we're going to spray if we absolutely have to. And we think that we can use remote sensing technology, cameras mounted on drones, to classify where we're going to have problems, so we can drive to those locations and then put in the treatments that need to be done. We also think with the spray app that we are putting out, this phone app and website, that we can help you guys get more performance out of your chemicals and make sure that you really get the coverage that you need for these pests to succumb, to get them controlled. So we will reduce the number of pesticide applications because there is a lot of applications going out there where you're basically just wasting fuel because it's going straight upwards. It may come out of the nozzle downwards, but it's evaporating and going straight up. You're just spraying the neighbor's field. We also think we can, instead of spraying the whole paddock, we can go to more targeted approaches. We think that we can increase the performance because those patches where we are going to spray are now going to be sprayed with better volume. We're going to put the adjuvant in, use the right nozzles to really get good canopy penetration. And by using the fertilizers, we think that there's going to be less problems with pests establishing in the first place. And with all of this, we're going to have less resistance development, and therefore we will also get more mileage out of the chemicals that we have. So we rely less on new chemicals coming on the market. And with that, I want to conclude and just thank Coco for sponsoring the particular project on the phone app, and I hope to see you in the Coco booth, and we'll play with some spray cards and some squirt bottles. Thank you very much. So we have just started scratching the surface on this, and we think that potassium is just one. There's going to be other nutrients, other macronutrients, and there's also going to be more like micronutrients that could be used. Some of them the pests are going to be responding positively to. In this particular case, with potassium, there's a negative correlation, but with phosphorus and nitrogen, we would expect a positive correlation. So the more nitrogen you use, the more pests you're going to have. So all I'm saying is, all I'm here to really do is sort of plant a seed in people like yourself's head and make you start thinking about your fertilizer as also, it's also a gun here. It's not just about the yield. It's not just about the direct yield impact you have of this is also part of your pest management strategy. And then when you decide how much you're going to be putting out, how many times you're going to be putting out, in what formulation you're going to be putting it out, all of those things in conjunction with the soil qualities and all that, that ultimately leads to the risk of that will lead to the sum of how susceptible your crop is going to be. And we would love to work and do more work, and we need more crop physiologists and more entomologists to work on this and find out how can we use the nutrients, the fertilizers in a smart way. I wouldn't know, so I can't answer your question sort of point blank, but I can tell you that I think this is something we need to look at. Instead of relying so heavily on the chemicals and only spray when they're already established, when the weather conditions are perfect and food is unlimited, that's when you want to kill them? I mean, it's like any military strategist would tell you that is the dumbest thing you can do. You're trying to hit your enemy when he is strongest. You want to hit him when he is weakest and try to make sure that he doesn't get to you in the first place. And that's kind of, so we're pushing sort of our whole strategy upstream. See what I'm saying? And that's really what we're trying. So we should be looking at other nutrients as well, for sure. Absolutely. One of the reasons why we want to work with drones is because we can collect, we cannot fly particularly high. We need, and Hamlin was also talking about that this morning, it's very important to acquire the data at a very high spatial resolution so that pixels are only, say, 1 millimeter or 4 millimeters wide, okay? Very, very small, so that you have multiple pixels within a leaf. What you can then do is you can then filter the data so that you can set up everything that is equivalent to soil or rocks or the heads of the wheat if it's late in the season. You filter all that data out. So you can basically, because you have such a high spatial resolution, you can cherry pick your pixels. Imagine I only wanted in this image here what was blue. So I would set up a filter that would say they would eliminate everything except for this part of the shield, okay? It's the same thing that I would do. So that's part of my image processing. But I can only do that if my image data, my original data, has a high enough spatial resolution.